One of the more surprising entries on my CV, surprising to me at least, is that I have an honorary degree from Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. Here's the citation, and you'll see here Thessaloniki in Greek capitals. And the citation not only talks entirely in Greek about me, but also mentions here Claire, my wife, and Philippa, Richard and Joanna, my children, and my grandchildren, Phoebe and Rachel. Amy was not born at the time. Well, Thessaloniki is the second largest city in Greece and has played an interesting part in my life, one way and another. So let me backtrack a little and tell you why I ended up with these connections to the city, because the story is unusual. For 16 years, I ran a week-long residential research course in Oxford for postgraduate medics from around the world, everywhere from Australia to Peru, but mainly Europeans who wanted to undertake research in diabetes. The course concentrated substantially on statistics and mathematics, but was highly interactive and involved all sorts of models and constructions, and of course my trusty trunk was in evidence from which to produce the next illustration. Well, one graduate from Thessaloniki, Apostolos by name, became sufficiently interested in the teaching and excited by the environment that he wrote to me after the course asking if he might come and work with me in Oxford for a while, to which I readily agreed. And shortly after he arrived, I mentioned that there was a link to Thessaloniki in our family, because my wife Claire's grandfather, Marcus Niebuhr Todd, had been based there for 3 years in the First World War as an intelligence officer of the British Army. He was an Oxford Classics don and was fluent in Greek and in German. And in 1917, he watched with horror from a hill above Thessaloniki when a great fire erupted, destroying 2/3 of the city and leaving more than 70,000 people homeless. The fire burned for 32 hours and destroyed 9,500 houses over a full square kilometre. Apostolos, and he sounds as though he should be out of the New Testament, doesn't he, was astounded to learn of this link. His grandfather had been an intelligence officer in Thessaloniki at the same time, and we think they must have met. Well, who knows? What we do know, though, is that Claire's grandfather was sufficiently respected and had done something out there that led the French government to give him this, which is the Croix de Guerre avec palme. This diagonal palm cross here means it's the highest award that they could give of the Croix de Guerre. And so we still have that medal. And indeed, we also have here the handwritten account in Marcus Niebuhr's own handwriting of what went on during the First World War. And there are many pages of reminiscences here, all beautifully written out by hand. Well, Apostolos went on to set up a statistical research centre in Thessaloniki, and I visited there every year to teach. On a couple of occasions after I had lectured, Claire and I travelled on to other parts of Greece, including Philippi in Thrace. And so when I read about Paul's second missionary journey in the Acts of the Apostles, Philippi and Thessaloniki are not just names. They are real places where I've walked among the old Roman ruins, and my steps covering the ground where Paul stood and preached. Well, why am I telling you all this? It's because we have to remember always that we stand in a direct line of Christian heritage from all those people that Paul met and talked to. The real people who felt then as modern as you and I feel today. The last time that Claire was asked to read from an epistle in the church, she said, yes, well, I hope Paul isn't being too obtuse. We tend to drift off in our heads during these readings, as you must have done, and perhaps I have done, and you might even done a moment ago, thinking about lunch or taking another sip of your coffee and, yes, yawning while we try and listen to some knotty theology from the letters of Paul. Yakety, 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 yak. Where is Thessaloniki anyway? But what I want to tell you now is why I'm excited by today's reading. First, a bit of context. Paul had a vision while in Troas, and a man, and he might have been called Apostolos, the name after all means emissary, pleads with Paul to come across to Macedonia, of which Thessaloniki was by far the largest city. Come over to Macedonia and help us. So Paul sets out and gets to Philippi first, and has quite an adventure there, and then on to Thessaloniki, westwards. We read in Acts chapter 17 about his visit. Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Well, then things turn a bit nasty, and some jealous people reckon on stopping Paul. So they start a riot and rush round looking for Paul and Silas, and they're keeping well out of the way. The crowd get hold of Jason, who's his host, and drag him in front of the magistrates, who get him to pay a bond and keep the peace. Well, then at night, Paul and Silas scuttle off further west to Berea, a town pretty well due west from Thessaloniki and a bit north of Mount Olympus. And on foot, according to Google Maps here, it would take you about 11 to 15 hours. Well, I don't think Paul would have been using the app. So later, when Paul is down in Corinth, where he keeps himself in business during the working week with his old profession of tent making, he sends Timothy back to the Thessalonians just to see how they're doing. And he gets the thumbs up when Timothy returns. And he writes a hurrah letter to the Thessalonians. And here are some of the wonderful things about the letter. First of all, most scholars think it's the first letter that we have from Paul, written within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So astonishingly, what you have heard today is the very first documentation of our Christian faith, the very first written testimony that Jesus died and rose again. For the Gospels and other letters were written later, and some much later. It celebrates that the Thessalonians have managed to keep going in their faith and witness, even though Paul had been with them for only about 3 or 4 weeks. It's a thank you letter. It bubbles with enthusiasm. It's full of hope. It's full of encouragement. But it also speaks to us today. Wherever you are, whoever you are, the message is for you and for me. And here, in the Voice translation, is part of that letter. In fact, not only has the message of our Lord thundered from your gathering into Macedonia and Achaia, but everywhere we go, your faith in God is talked about, so we don't even have to say a thing. You see, they go on and on telling us the story of how you welcomed us when we were introduced to you, and how you turned towards God and realigned your life to serve the one true living God. And so in these disturbing times of upheaval and of challenge, when we're all suffering from what the Archbishop of Canterbury has recently described as uncertainty fatigue, and when it's easy to lose heart, we need to remember the Thessalonians of old and the Thessalonians now. 2,000 years ago, they managed to dodge the riots and establish a living faith in the face of all sorts of opposition and aggression. 100 years ago, they saw their city burnt to ruins in a time of war, but rebuilt it better and healthier than it had been before. Today, Apostolos, perhaps a descendant from those early Christians, continues medical care in Thessaloniki and continues to publish, often with me as co-author, statistical meta-analyses in the world of diabetes science. And the fingers of all of this history stretch forwards and backwards, so that Paul's clarion call still rings down the centuries to us. Keep going despite the afflictions and oppositions. Keep the faith. Encourage one another. Celebrate what we have and what we can become. Here again in the Voice translation is his message. We always thank God for all of you in our prayers. Your actions on behalf of the true faith, your tireless toil of love, and your unfailing, unwavering, unending hope in our Lord Jesus have put you consistently at the forefront of our thoughts. Oh, brothers and sisters loved by God, we know he has chosen you, and here is why. What you experienced in the good news we brought you was more than words funneling into your ears. It came to you as a life-empowering, Spirit-infused message that offers complete hope and assurance. Well, may it do that for us too in our own unsettling times.